Welcome back to the Vanderbilt Political Review podcast. Today I have another special treat for all of you guys. We have one of our new contributors, RaeAnna Morales. She wrote a piece on DEI and how she believes that it really undermines the purported values of diversity and equality in the institutions in which it is applied. So she joined me today to talk about that. Here's the episode. Well, we are doing this podcast for a second time because of my ineptitude. I was recording computer audio, and it was a wonderful episode, but with terrible audio. But it's my honor again to bring back the wonderful RaeAnna Morales to the VPR podcast. Is this your first year writing for VPR?
Yes,
first year. So I guess welcome aboard.
Thank
you. I think it was your first article you had put out, right? Or did you?
Yeah,
okay,
just
perfect.
recently.
Talking about DEI and diversity and the proper place for that in our various institutions in this country. It's kind of on the spot, but if you just want to summarize your general take, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, so basically DEI has been hugely controversial in society lately, and especially on Vanderbilt's campus. We see with Trump coming in office, he signed 4 executive orders addressing this and abolishing DEI in many institutions. And in a Supreme Court case, they kind of got rid of the admission process in colleges that weighed heavily on DEI, but that was only in educational institutions, but now it's abolished for all institutions, and that was kind of the fight and the political controversy around that. So I kind of highlighted how Vanderbilt played a role in this, and there's a lot of back and forth on whether this is okay or acceptable, but in my article I highlight that using different strategies under DEI is the way to go about diversity and equality in America. And so building up the education from the ground up in schools and setting equal standards and job opportunities for all races and people from different backgrounds, that's the way to achieve that diversity and equality rather than promoting DEI initiatives.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, you are not only okay with, but you are actively for diversity. If I'm wrong, correct me. It's just the way DEI sought to go about having diversity in these varying institutions was incorrect. Is that a correct characterization?
Yeah, diversity and equality is needed, and it's a necessity in all institutions. And I think it's an amazing reflection of the American dream for many different backgrounds. So I think we definitely need that. And I think all races and identities should be on the same level platform, but I think they should all be able to strive and work equally to get to the highest achieving. And I think DEI places some in that category above others.
Okay. And when you say that you believe all races should be at the same level, do you mean the same level of expectations held for them? Because one argument you hear in response to what you're saying is, well, if without DEI, what you'll have, because of, well, one reason people might or will certainly cite is all the historical oppression that's happened to, let's say, black people in America or even other racial groups in America who've had barriers to their success historically. And the argument would go that, okay, several generations, many generations, had oppression, and that sets them way behind in terms of their future generations actually achieving success, and therefore DEI is needed to give them that push, if you will, that they didn't have, that other races or other identities that didn't have that oppression. A lot there, but I'm sure you might have heard that argument before. Yeah. Like that's like the purpose of DEI, to make up for those past atrocities, those past repressive activities. What's your response to that general train of thought?
Yeah, so there's many racial inequalities in America all over the world. But I think the way to prevent that is instead to focus on making sure hiring opportunities, like people who hold those positions, understand the importance of racial equality and inclusion into the workforce. And I think setting this almost like a equal qualifications, but like we have to have the right people holding hiring positions to make sure that people of all races can get to those points. Mm-hmm. So I think starting from there and not focusing so much on DEI and giving them that push forward, but making sure they don't need that push forward because they're standing at that level ground with all other races. And they have the opportunities to take, and they're given the same opportunities as other people in America to reach that point that they desire.
All right, I'll play devil's advocate a little more. So one argument that I've heard against affirmative action, which is a form of DEI, broadly speaking, some people might quibble about that, but generally speaking, a lot of people will say, okay, well, you have certain racial groups like African Americans and Hispanics who, without affirmative action, at least in theory, but we've kind of seen it in practice since it fell, would constitute a much smaller contingent of classes, and what the groups that would have a lot more, really the group that would have a lot more people is Asians. And it's kind of a stereotype, but stereotypes come from something, it's kind of true, So I guess the concern would be that, okay, yeah, you're holding everyone to an equal standard, but you have certain groups that, let's say because of the past oppression or whatever it is, aren't able to meet those standards now, and then thus can't break into these institutions to raise their standards, and then it's like a vicious cycle. Whereas the groups that have been there already, like the whites and Asians, just basically get to continue their cycle of prosperity.
Yeah, I completely understand that argument, and I don't think the solution for that is DEI. I think the solution has to come from somewhere else. So we see most of these individuals in these minorities group struggle at a childhood level and through poverty in childhood, and then they go to schools that are underfunded where they can't reach that full potential. So I think starting at the base level of schools, that making sure they have appropriate funding and resources, we can make sure kids from those minority groups have equal access and have the same ability and opportunity to learn in the way that other majority groups do.
Okay. Lots of directions we can go from here. I'll take it in this direction for now. Do you think that, or how much of this do you think has to do with, not to be too blunt, but I'll be blunt, some people making excuses for themselves, right? Because one thing that I've heard growing up is, speaking obviously as a black man, growing up in a black family, lots of black people complain, and you can say rightfully so, and I would say rightfully so, about what happened in the past. However, this is what I heard growing up, other groups have had not the exact same level of oppression. No two sets of oppression are exactly the same, but comparable oppression, but they've progressed, right? The Asians are an example of this, right? Like being Chinese in America in the 1800s, the Chinese Exclusion Act, it wasn't fun, to say the least. But that's a group, broadly speaking, that has certainly made it a name for themselves. And basically, almost any immigrant group that I can think of has a similar effect happening with them. That doesn't happen in certain communities. I guess, why do you think that is? Let's start with that. Yeah, so kind of on the spot, but why do you think those disparities happen? You have certain groups that are oppressed in some ways, and they seemingly overcome that. And you have other groups who are oppressed, who, to be I guess charitable about it, like have a lot more difficulty overcoming that. Just ruminations on that. I know it's kind of on the spot, but
yeah. So I think America definitely has struggled with racism. I mean, we look to slavery in the past, and that was the most horrific thing. And I think our country has progressed so much, and we should recognize that as well. But I think we see racism in many different groups. I mean, you see some people on the left now hating on white people just for being white and standing up for themselves or saying something. But I also think we can look at DEI and raising some above others as a form of racism.
Right, yeah.
Just because they identify with this group, but their qualifications don't reach a certain standard or aren't as high as other basic white American that they may claim, I think that can also be considered a form of racism too, wanting to raise one higher because of their identity over someone else who may be more qualified for a job, a position, or enrollment in a college.
But now I'm sure you can hear the response, like, well, these are the same people, not literally, obviously, because nobody who did slavery, for example, is alive anymore, but they mean the same people group, right?
Yeah. That
inflicted this oppression on of another people group, right? And some people might even say it's not even racism because of that reason, or if they do admit it's racism, they'd say that, well, it's okay because it's a form of reparations, right?
Yeah.
They would never put it like that, but just to distill the argument, that's basically what it comes down to. Your response to that sort of line of reasoning?
So I think if we go in that cycle, it's just never going to end in America. We can look at so many different events and wars, and we can single out specific groups for whether they were oppressed or raised higher than one another. But I don't think that's not today, and that's not the present. And I think in order to progress from these instances and these terrible oppression of certain groups, that we have to look at each other as equals, no matter what group, no matter what part of a war or a society dilemma that they were involved in. So I think we just have to look at each other on a playing ground. And like you said, like people today, no one was slaves.
Yeah.
So like we do have to move past that at some time in order to progress as a country.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I heard one time is, might have been my family too, who knows? But I remember hearing it around, just like the Jewish community does this very well, right? Like, you will not forget the Holocaust, right? You won't. But the Jewish community, they're not saying because of the Holocaust we can't progress, we can't make, they're saying the Holocaust happened, don't forget it, it's very bad, but we're not going to let that hold us back. And in a way, that's I think a very I think that's the way you best honor the ancestors who went through whatever form of oppression it might be. And I'll apply to the Black community. I think the best way the Black community, and now we're kind of getting off topic here, but I'll bring it back, I promise. But I think the best way the Black community can honor the people who went through the civil rights era, and then before that slavery and everything like that, is to be the best you can be, to, I guess, to bring it back to our topic here, by merit, rise up and truly, again, be the best you can be. Bringing it back now. I guess the question would be, the facts on the ground still remain, though, that there are certain groups that either because of the oppression itself, as some people want to claim, or maybe as I want to claim more because of not the best response after said oppression, right? For whatever reason, many of these groups still struggle in terms of reaching these qualifications you're talking about, which would lead to the effect, by natural consequence, of these groups being underrepresented or severely underrepresented in many of these institutions like education. Mm-hmm. You're talking about how education at a low level, like perhaps kindergarten, primary schooling, could help to bring these people up to meeting these qualifications. You mentioned that earlier. Could you elaborate on any thoughts with regard to that?
Yeah, so I think your childhood has a huge impact on you. And I think even like Black children or Hispanics growing up in a family that tells them consistently, like, you're not going to have the same thing as other people in society because of the way you look, or you're not going to be able to get this grade in school or get this job because of how you look. I don't think that's a healthy environment to build for your children. I don't think that they should necessarily. I think it's important to highlight the history of the disparities and difficulties of a group, but I don't think you should build your life off of that when it was in the past. So I think we need to focus on pulling them kids into school and teaching them the same as everyone else as we're doing now, but making sure they have resources and adequate education that they can learn that history, but then they can also learn the present and see how many different figures, racial and identities hold amazing offices and at the highest level of companies, and that they can see success in their group while also acknowledging the history of past oppression.
Right. So I suppose it's, I guess, sort of like that example of the Jewish community I gave earlier, acknowledge the past, remember it, don't forget the past, but don't let that hold you down, right? But I guess at a different level, there's a question of, many of these people among different, ethnic, racial groups, it's really maybe even a class problem. Either don't have the money, right? Don't have the resources, or raised perhaps and we were talking about the family earlier, or at least I alluded to it, or raised in a disadvantageous familial situation. You can go down the list. I mean, many things can go wrong, such that, you hold everyone to the same qualification. I'm kind of hitting the same point because it's these same concerns people bring up, right? You have all these equal qualifications, equal in name, but because like if you have, you know, Richie Rich here, I'm not sure if you've seen the movie from the 90s, but you know, if you have Richie Rich who has a whole ton of money, right, and he can buy all the, or I guess pay for all the best SAT tutors, right, and he can, you know, like do all the extracurriculars, get a great golf coach, get a golf, you know, you get the idea, versus someone else who doesn't have those opportunities. I guess, what do you say to that inherent disparity, that inherent inequality that will exist, unless we're all going to be equal, like in a Soviet-style system?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge the difference between wealth and race. There's always going to be people wealthier than you, other than like Elon Musk, of course, or something. And there's always going to be people that are poorer than you. But I think making sure that people understand the American dream and how they can work their way up, that's important to not like let people look down on society, that they know they can build their way up and that there's something in the future to work forward to. So I think just knowing that there's always going to be someone better off and someone worse than you, and just learning to individually build yourself up in the best way that you possibly can. And most education, everyone learns in a different way. So I think if we work on education and make that more adequate for all groups, that teachers can help focus on individual plans and building each student up throughout the classroom.
Yeah. I guess a different, slightly related idea that I guess relates to all this is just that, this is, at least in my view, and maybe you can respond to this, like, you kind of touch on this, right? There'll always be someone richer than you, always someone poorer than you, that this idea of having, you know, even for between genders, right, 50-50 workplaces, more or less 50-50 spaces, that became a big push, I would say, maybe roughly 20 years ago. I don't know, I'm kind of just like, you know, guessing here, but roughly in the between 20 and 30 years ago, this push for gender equality in engineering and all these different industries became a big push. I think that's tied to DEI, racial equality in all these places. However, it's kind of my view, I don't think, especially in the gender side of things, I do think gender is very, you know, the sexual differences between men and women, I think, really, I think affect our behavior, affects what we're predisposed to, you know, like and dislike, right? But even on a racial level, like you're never going to have a perfect, you know, a breakdown of the races in any sort of industry, right? And I think so far as those inequalities exist, I think even in terms of merit, right? As long as that exists, I don't think the way you fix those problems is by artificially inflating the count. I'll give you a quick example here, then I'll let you respond, because I know I've been talking a lot in this podcast, more than I typically do. But, you know, even with colleges, right? Like, if your argument is because there's broad underachievement in the Black and Hispanic community, let's be honest, like really, especially in the Black community, if we're being totally honest with ourselves here, the way to solve that, they would say, is to inflate the number of Black students at a given college. I don't see that solving the problem. All I see is you putting a whole ton of people who aren't ready for a certain level into a level where they're not primed to succeed. And yeah, sure, of course, some of them are going to succeed. Many of them are going to succeed, you know? That's not the point. But as a whole, I suspect that it doesn't really redound to their benefit over time. There's a point here somewhere, and I'm not just rambling, I promise. I guess just, yeah, what is your response to this idea that there just won't, if we really look at merit, there just won't ever really be a perfect sort of proportionality amongst all these different demographic groups?
Yeah. And yeah, so we see that in many different, but also like the averaging out of each racial group isn't even either in America. It's like appropriate to understand that there is more of a white population than a Black population. And that's going to lead to disparities in the workforce too.
Right.
But like for education, I think it's important to look at the problem that maybe a significantly lower portion of Black students are being accepted than white students are meeting those qualifications. Right. That's a problem, but the problem isn't letting the underqualified students into the college. The problem is seeing why they aren't ready for that college or why they aren't meeting that expectation. And that's how looking into like high school and middle school and lower levels like that where you can find where that problem begins and how to fix it there, to where when at college admissions you can see the black students eventually get higher scores and that they should be accepted into the colleges.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a problem, but the problem can't be fixed by just allowing them to enter the workforce and education when they're not ready, but other people are. There's a problem on a lower level that gets them there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like you not wanting a tree to be there, right? And you just keep pruning the tree, right? Just keep clipping the branches. Like, why do the branches keep coming back? And then you realize that, hey, the way to actually get to the root of the problem is to get into the root of the tree, right? Yeah. Really bad analogy, but I think the idea is there enough.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Perhaps it's because one side might argue that it's politically inexpedient for a certain political side to do that, but without going down that uncharitable path, I think it's just a hard thing to do. I think it's easier just to try to put a Band-Aid on the solution, to try to just simply prune the tree, right, hoping that it'll go away. In letting a lot of minority students in under DEI that in any other case under meritocracy wouldn't be let in, instead of actually just getting to those root problems. I think you brought up a good amount of them. I think education is a big part of it, especially in the districts with a lot of minority students tend to be the ones that also have very bad schools. And then that's another question. Again, this is hard, right? It's another question of, okay, is that because the schools are being run bad, or is it because there are conditions outside of the education system that are just not lending themselves to these students performing well? Or is it, and this probably is the answer, some combination of both, right? Yeah. It's a very hard thing to solve.
Yeah, it's hard to identify the problem, but it's still worthwhile to find it.
Right. Yeah. But I guess the point also is that even after, let's say you fix inner city schools, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm going off stereotypes, but let's we can just a part of getting to the actual core of the issue is cutting past all the euphemisms, right? And just getting speaking bluntly. But even if you were to fix all the problems, if you waved your magic wand, there still wouldn't be this perfect diversity that people desire. And I guess what I'm getting at, maybe you can respond to this, is just like, because you started off by saying that diversity is desirous, right? But for me, it's almost like, it's of course like there's going to be a natural diversity of people in any place in a country that's inherently this diverse, right? And be weird to walk into a workplace, assuming that you're not like in middle of Wisconsin where there are only white people, right? But like, assuming you're in a place where there are multiple races, it'd be kind of weird if you walk into a workplace and there's only like white people. A little strange, right? Yeah. But I guess what I'm getting at is like, is looking at diversity as a goal to be worked toward, period, is that a mistake in and of itself? Is it really something? Is it not really something that should just come of consequence and not really be something that we're working towards or looking toward?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a problem, and it's been talked through by Donald Trump and in politics about a colorblind society. It shouldn't matter.
That was in your article, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It shouldn't matter what color an individual is. It should matter how they got to that point.
Right.
Their life story and their qualifications matter more than just the color. So I think as long as that individual has the requirements to hold that job position or to be in that college, yeah, the diversity is great. And I think different diverse perspectives bring new things to an environment, and they do bring new skills and new qualities that they've learned throughout their life living in that different environment. Mm-hmm. But I don't think just solely based off of what they look like or genetics should be the reason that they're in a certain position. And
I'll ask you two more questions here before we wrap up. My first question will be about that idea of colorblind society, right? I've heard a lot of arguments against that by saying that it's not realistic.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a kind of a two-parter. First of all, when you say colorblind, do you mean that it's a goal that should be worked toward, even though we in a society, as of right now, like I see you and I can tell that at least you're in part Hispanic, right? Mm-hmm. Ignoring your last name, I can just like look at you and tell, right? Like
Indian and Canary Islander.
Well, there you go, right? But I'd be lying to myself if I were to like look at you and ignore that.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously looking at me, if you look at me and ignoring the fact that I'm black is, it's like, come on, like it's quite obvious, right? So I guess the question is, what does color blindness blindness mean to you? And how do you address this objection that it's just, unrealistic? Again, as I said, if you look at me, I'm obviously a black man. To say that you're going to be colorblind is just patently ridiculous. What would you say to that idea?
Yeah, so I think it's amazing how we have so many different diversities and religions throughout America. And I think that does add so much to who a person is. But I think colorblind means when you look at someone, you don't think of them higher on a certain level or lower. You don't think them higher in this career or lower in this aspect of their lives or inferior to someone else just because of the way they look. Right. It's more of like a mental or academic colorblind thing than like a completely colorblind, I guess.
So I acknowledge, for example, that you are Hispanic, right? Kind of? Okay.
Indian Canary Island.
Oh, okay. But I can acknowledge the race you are, right?
Yeah.
Without that affecting how I think of you.
Yeah, like who you are as a person.
Right. And I guess
I'm not going to look at you and be like, oh, he's basic, like black person, maybe in poverty or not in a good education or something like that. I look at you the same way I would look at a white person if they were sitting in front of me.
Yeah. I'll press it. One more thing. I was going to wrap up, but I think we're getting somewhere interesting here. There's just even a pushback on this idea, even from some on the right, I would say. And I'll give you an example, right? It's a classic pattern recognition example. Let's say there's a green grocer. No one says it anymore. That's such an old style term, green grocer. Let's say that there's a bodega owner, right? Okay. And green grocer. Sorry, I'm kind of laughing at myself. No one says green grocer anymore. I don't know why I said that. Let's say that there's a bodega, right, owner, and let's say there are 3 robberies over the last, not month, that's kind of a lot. Let's say the last couple months, right? 2 months. So basically like a robbery every 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And let's say in every single case, it's a black person, right? It's a black guy even. Let's make it even more specific, right? And let's say the community is somewhat mixed. There's some Hispanics. Let's say it's like the Bronx, right? There's a lot of Puerto Ricans, black people there too. So it's not like everyone's a black person. So obviously, right? And then, would you say that it would be unreasonable? Definitely like not ideal, but unreasonable for that shop owner to, I guess the word would be prejudge, right? When someone walks to the door and it's a black guy, would you say it's unreasonable for that man, that bodega owner, to even think twice, right? And again, I think everyone would agree that it's not ideal, right? Ideally, this would not be the case at all, right? Maybe even the bodega owner's like, I can't help these unconscious thoughts, right? Or subconscious thoughts, but they come. Do you think that is unreasonable? And then how do you think that fits into the whole colorblind thing you're talking about? Again, on the spot, but...
Yeah. No, I would say that's unreasonable. I think there's a difference in acknowledging the statistics and maybe the police knowing who to look for, not like targeting a specific group, but I mean, if you have a picture of someone who committed a robbery and you go out and find people who look like them and see if they're the correct person. But no, I think if someone walks in the shop and whether their statistic, their group is higher on the robbery list, that they shouldn't be looked at any different.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the shop owner can do his own security for every individual and watch over his shop the same way for anyone in there.
Funnily enough, and I'll close with this, I actually disagree. I think it's not unreasonable. I think it's far from ideal. And I would imagine that bodega owner would not want to think that way. Mm-hmm. But assuming I think, I do think it's reasonable, even rational, to be skeptical. It's a pattern recognition sort of thing.
You can acknowledge the statistic, but still not take a step forward to bring that individual down or double check them when they haven't even bought anything.
For the sake of the podcast and the fact that this will be my voice on the internet forever, I'm not saying that then that bodega owner ought to let that subconscious thought enter the realm of active harassment, active, racism, bigotry, hatred. Yeah. I'm not saying you should ban black men from his shop or anything like that, but no, I do think that, if you're being robbed consistently by black men in this hypothetical, that is, looking at the statistics, is not probably the most unreasonable hypothetical for being real about this, right? And different topic as to why that's happening. and it's sad. But yeah, it would follow that he would be skeptical, even of me walking into that building, and that's a sad thing in and of itself. But RaeAnna?
My first thought is
last
being
word.
able to acknowledge like the attitudes and the way a person carries themselves. Also, like what I think is, if I was a shop owner and I saw someone walking in, and my first thought is that statistically that person is in the group that usually robs my store.
Yes.
I think I would focus on the attitudes, how they carry themselves.
That'll definitely play into it.
Like
and I'll be honest, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, right? There would be a difference, even in this hypothetical, if I were to walk in there dressed the way I am right now, in a blazer, in trousers and in a button-up, right? So many rabbit holes you could go down. Hopefully, this is not taken out of context, because we did touch on some very touchy subjects for some people. But I appreciate your bravery in that regard, RaeAnna, and I appreciate you again for re-recording this podcast with me. I think it went better this time, so the second time around. So
thank you for having me.
No problem. Take care.